Okay. Ready? Good. Panel? Good. Cool. Okay. 3, 2, 1. There's going to be an important piece of framing that's going to run through this entire debate that you should definitely adjudicate this debate on. 1. Political messaging is not always good, but our case will engage in both sides when political messaging is good and when it isn't. But opposition has to stand for cases of non-liberal examples, e.g. old Disney, e.g. cartoons not from the West that do not advocate for liberal values. It's not all about save the trees, sometimes it's about hate the gays. This is something opposition has to stand for because political messaging is not uniform. As opposed to morality is almost always universal. Why? Because morality, as interpreted especially by cartoonists, has to be simple, something that people agree upon, and it's usually based upon Abrahamic values, the basic lines that happen in all of religious texts, such as be kind to your neighbor, love the people around you, values that everybody agrees on, because cartoonists want to make the least people angry at the point where they're just doing ethical comparisons as opposed to political ones. Political comparisons are people who have conceded that they're going to make some people angry, and they're willing to double down on this message, e.g. not everybody agrees we should prioritize saving the trees, but they still made the Lorax, knowing some people would dislike that. Cool. Now, two primary things that are going to come in this speech. One, why ethics are more important than politics, and two, why backlash is going to be significant. Before that, Aniket, what? The depoliticization movement I don't care who is exactly pushing it. What they care about is specifically why we should oppose the ideas that political messaging happens within cartoons because of two primary things. One, because of exclusivity. Note, at the point where you have cartoons, children have a limited amount of time that they can spend watching cartoons. Why? First of all, they have a limited amount of things that they can keep in their small little brains. When they come out of a theater or when they watch a show, they only have some things that they're willing to, that are going to stay in their head. Two, when they mimic actions from only specific types of content. Not all of it is extremely proximate. You can notice this by in the announcement told we sang some songs, we did not sing other songs, right? Meaning there is some point of mutual exclusivity. And three, kids just have a limited time that they can spend watching cartoons, right? Because they have to go to school, they have to go to the playground, they have parents forbidding them of watching specific content or watching a quantity of content that is enough, right? Cool, and that there is a limited time frame where children are truly susceptible to messaging, meaning at some point they become too old, so cartoons become too childish for them, meaning they stop watching them. They maybe come back to them when they're older, but that's not really the scope of this debate, right? Meaning there is mutual exclusivity exists between shoving ethical messages versus political messages within cartoons. Now, a couple of things are going to happen. One, you need ethics now, you don't need politics now. Why? If ethical messages exist within cartoons, they should usually be kind to your friends. This is hold the door for people. This is don't be a dick, right? This is give compliments, don't make fun of people, don't cause bodily harm, things like that. This is internalized in children because it's a very easy message to stomach and it's very proximate. They already are born with an ingrained sense of justice, either from just suffering from the human condition or either by being taught implicitly getting this from the community around them that this is something that is not positive, but it is truly ingrained when they do something when they see something that they like. Because kids want to be like their favorite superheroes. They want to be like the people in the cartoons because this is something that they feel a parasocial relationship to. They want to mimic the actions that they see in cartoons with their friends. This is how they make fun. This is how they do make believe, right? They copy the actions even if they don't understand them. They copy them. So at least they're buying into the bias and creating a path dependency of doing good things, even if it is just because the characters in your favorite shows are doing this. Now look, I know opening opposition is going to try to have their, both opposition teams are going to try to have their cake and eat it too. They're going to try to say, oh, but political messaging can also have ethical dilemmas. To that case, we can also similarly maybe co-opt saying, okay, political messaging can be pushed down, be a secondary factor here, but not the primary factor. But also, note that this is not the same. Meaning, at the point where you have ethical things and ethical actions as a primary point of something, kids are more likely to find this proximate and more likely to emotionally resonate with this. It's easier to copy the behavior of SpongeBob and Patrick hugging each other because they're such good friends than mimicking the behavior of Lorax saying, I speak for the trees, because who the fuck knows what speaking for the trees means? Trees do not speak. This is not something that I emotionally resonate with. Meaning, at the point where kids primarily internalize ethical values, they're primarily good actors around the peers around them. They're better at the playground. They're better to their peers. They're better to their parents. They're simply better citizens, and they create better people later on. Because of this path dependency, they continue acting more akin to this at the point where they're adults, as opposed to political messaging. By the same analogy, maybe opening opposition is going to try to claim that they create better political actors. But the inverse is not true. They do not create better political actors because politics is influenced more primarily and more proximately by other things, e.g. things your parents taught you. So either the case is the same, my parents will already teach me that cutting down trees is not a good thing, or it is not that they will not teach me this, meaning I'm still going to primarily take the political opinions of my parents or of my peers more more proximate to that, and I'm going to take that of cartoons. But before there, Zarina, please.
By your own analysis, all you've done is that this is one part to implement ethical values, yet you go on to explain why this would be the only part by which you can implement ethical values. Why is that?
Note, this is exactly the point I am making. This is the primary path that kids can consume ethical values, even if their parents do not teach them, but it is not the primary path that they will consume political values, meaning the political messaging there is less likely to reach them than the ethical messaging that is likely to be there, because they will develop their political beliefs later. At the point where they're forming their political beliefs, these political beliefs are probably judged on other metrics. They're judged on news, they're judged on what their parents think, they're judged on other life experiences they've had. Nobody says, oh, should I be pro-green? Well, we've seen the Lorax, right? This is not something that is realistically the thought process of somebody forming political opinions, meaning young children are incapable of internalizing the political beliefs. Note, also, these cartoons are usually just go over the kids' heads. I still don't know, like what the primary messaging of some cartoons I've watched as a child are, right? Who knows what Save the Trees means? Who knows what the vilification of minorities by police means to a child who is 6 or 7 years old? They see bunnies and they see focuses, and the ethical messaging is the primary point that should be emphasized, because at the point where you de-emphasize the ethical messaging to get political messaging, at that point kids have less access and are less likely to adopt the ethical messaging that is fundamentally good because of ethical cartoons. And two, on the point of backlash. Look, at the point where you have political messaging as the primary narrative in your story, it is much more easily for center-right or far-right media to portray this as liberal woke bullshit. At that point, two things happen. One, it's more likely that some kids are going to be locked out of seeing this, right? And two, it's more likely that the kids that do see this on one side of the spectrum are going to be shied away from this. Meaning, to the extent that the Lorax has a political message, kids are going to be shied away from this because parents are more likely to buy into the idea that it's woke bullshit. And two, some kids are just not going to be able to see this. Meaning, one, less far for kids, and two, less positive messaging overall. So insofar as opposition is going to say that this is positive political messaging, there's going to be less of it at the point where it's the primary emphasis. If you do want to push it, it's much easier to push it as a secondary or tertiary metric, something that kids will also buy into at the point where there is an ethical messaging that is out on the front. This is less likely to happen with ethical cartoons, because parents will say, oh, but this is like the old cartoons I used to watch, I shouldn't ban my child from looking at this. This is also seen as not controversial, something I don't disagree with inherently. For all these reasons, proud to propose.
Sorry for the cough. Okay. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. What OG tell you isn't sufficient to win, because at most they tell you that this isn't helpful. And in the worst case scenario, this isn't helpful. Kids won't internalize this, they won't benefit from it. But we're going to posit a best case scenario where they do. If the truth is somewhere in the middle, it means that our benefits sometimes happen, they don't have harms that overcome that. I'm going to explain why these messages are likely to be good, why alternatives for learning political messaging are bad, why kids are likely to be able to internalize this well, and why we have to get to them while they're kids. First, a metric. What does it mean for something to be good when we discuss political messaging? First, we want to be informative. We want to inform people about the most salient issues in an engaging way that allows them to actually learn. So climate change is dry, the Lorax and hugging trees and loving them is fun or wet, I don't know. Anything that relies on anything that relies on personal experience that some people can't experience. I can never have the experience of being a woman. Seeing Barbie and seeing two flip sides of a gender-based society that's restrictive of the minority gender makes me internalize that in a way I never would just living as a man. And finally, anything that goes against tribalism. I don't need political messaging to know what my own neighbors want, my own community. If I'm a secular Jew in Israel, I know what secular Jews want. Political messaging is how I find out what everyone else wants, what people who I don't meet want. Why is this important? We don't want politics to just be about groups sharing power in a tit-for-tat agreement designed for everyone to benefit themselves. We want our politics to be all of us fighting for a better world. And a better world doesn't just mean better for us, it means better for everyone who lives with us. Given that, let's get into why these messages are likely to be liberal and good. What do OG say here? They tell us that this isn't, first of all, they say morality is universal, so they think that everyone is kind, empathic, and honest. which I'm fine with because this would mean that all political views would come out of these inherent moral views. So I concede this, but I think this works for my side. But then they say there are counterexamples, there are specific examples where the right did it. What do they tell us? Old Disney. That doesn't count. That's not purposeful political views. That's just underlying racism. We need a real example to go against the many examples in the songs and the infosod we got. And then they say it's non-Western. Sure. Sometimes we have right-wing ideology movies in small countries, in niche, even in the West. They usually do really badly. Like, either they're not in English or they appeal to a very small group. There are these, like, alt-right American movies, but they don't have a wide audience. Generally, right-wing ideology doesn't translate well into story and media. Right-wing is about having a small government, minimizing taxes. It's hard to make a movie about how expensive it is for me when I have to give 50% of my income to income tax. It's far easier to talk about a minority who don't have any access to anything. It's harder to run a movie about deontological principles of what the state can and can't do for me. It's far easier to show utility, people being harmed unfairly, vulnerable people that your heart goes out to. Why? Because of the universal moral values they said: kindness, empathy, and honesty. Okay, so why beyond more than right-wing, why else are we likely to get liberal messaging? We get more of a crowd. We have a specific minority to draw on. So Black Panther knows that they're going to have tons of Black Americans watching it, and maybe Arabs in Israel if they identify with a Black American experience. Secondly, we have hot topic issues that people feel strongly about. Some proportion of the population love environmentalism or care about it so much they're going to watch any significant piece of media about it. But beyond that, the creators are liberal. This means that the Hollywood media personnel are a bunch of leftist liberals representing a wide, diverse cast of different backgrounds and ethnicities who want to create content for a diverse range of the audience. Now, sure, there may be capitalist owners, but this is California capitalists. This isn't Bulgarian right-wing people. It's still people who live in San Francisco, the gay capital of the world. So, but finally, the audience is liberal. Most of the wealthier consumers in the West, most of the parents who tell their kids watch cartoons rather than go play sports or go study are going to be people who are further left, just a large majority of them. Let's move on. Finally, oversight. If we have bad messaging, we have the parents, we have journalists, we critics, all of whom come to criticize this and oversee this media. Let's move on then to why alternatives let's skip forward first to why kids can internalize these messages well. Note, even if some kids don't internalize them well, we don't care. That's true for every message. Some people are ambivalent to it. Doesn't matter to us. Why do we think they're likely to take it well? First, it's designed for them by experts, writers who want to appeal to kids, who want to have a clear and easily followable moral and story. Note, they professionalize specifically at writing movies, specifically at political messaging, specifically at movies for kids, specifically at political messaging for kids. They also outsource. They ask activists, expert in the field, i.e. environmentalists or psychologists, to help them make sure their message is correct and digestible. And finally, they have years to do it. The Barbie movie was announced in 2009. You write a few sketches. You have editors. You have a lot of people who look over this before it comes out. But beyond that, you have interpretations available. The kids can go to YouTube to watch what do their favorite YouTubers say about the new Barbie movie. There are parents who do respond when you ask them specific questions that they know how to answer, even if they don't know how to broach these topics with you. You have active discussions about it with your friends, with yourself, with your siblings. It's part of the process of going to watch a movie, especially one that resonates with you. And finally, it's similar to messages repeated in different content. So movie after movie about environmentalism are going to have the same message. But also on TikTok, I'm going to get a similar message. On online forums, when I look for articles, this is the most accessible version of the message, but I'm still likely to keep engaging with this message. Closing.
So how representative is Barbie of the experience in the world?
These political messages are simplistic. They're not the top thing you know. If this is what makes you go and read about feminism, for someone who has never seen feminism, Barbie is very significant. The entire right wing in the world talks about how much of a feminist movie Barbie is. Of course, as feminists, we might not agree. Why do we have to get to them as kids? Their opinions stabilize before age 18, without a chance to being exposed to other views, because it's not discussed in schools. Their parents have a singular perspective, and they have no alternative way to learn these things. They not only stabilize their opinions, they develop their habits. Do I eat meat? Do I recycle? Maybe if I watched movies about animals and about the environment, I would have these better habits in the first place that are harder to shift later on. They also can already have an impact. It's a positive impact, like Fridays for Future. It's a negative impact, like spreading bad views, perpetrating harmful racist or sexist views to the people around them. And finally, they become voters. At 18, they immediately begin voting on all topics and developing a party belonging. We have to get to them before that point. That point is too late. For all these reasons, opening opposition.
Okay, just a sec. Okay, is everyone ready? I'll take that as a yes. Just let me set up my timer. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Note a very important strategic mistake coming from opening opposition, and this frames out their whole case. I don't know why I need political messaging now when I am a kid. Note, this is a limited time frame, meaning that most of their examples, even from Black Panther to Barbie, are usually things I can consume later on in my life, meaning they never actually prove exclusivity on why I should start with these movies at an early age. I don't see why I just can't watch them when I'm 16 or 18. But note the comparative here. I believe it is better to consume them at that time. Why? Because firstly, if you watch them for the first time when you're 16 or 18, you're more likely to get that messaging, to understand it to a better extent. That means that you're more likely to internalize it and to actually, that being your political opinion, if they are correct. Note, if you watch it as a kid and if you don't understand that much, that means that you're less likely to revisit that movie. You're less likely to ever buy into it because it was strange. It was different to you. These kids don't, or these movies don't feature kids. I can't really know why Barbie is so sad. I can just see that Ken probably is an asshole, but other than that, I can't understand what it is to work and to be discriminated on by my boss. These political messages are not nuanced enough or understandable to kids. No engagement on that. But note, they never engage on why this messaging is going to lead and to form a political opinion of kids, and why are they going to be political actors. I hope closing engages there and fills the gap. And secondly, when they're talking about professional messaging and how it's going to be done in a good way, not only do their examples not support this, but it comes at a cost. It comes at the cost of specificity, meaning that the more you want this to be something that kids can digest, the less concrete you can be in how you want them to act as compared to broad ethical values that I'm going to explain through my speech. But then they try to engage with our case by just saying, oh, old Disney is not the example. The minority of cases, this is not just true. I think by their own examples or similar movies, this is just factually incorrect. Note the cartoons actually value some forms of nationalism. Look at, for example, Captain America or Superman blowing up a Middle Eastern country as the extension of American colonialism. I think these can still feature, and if they are correct, be internalized by kids, and they say that this is a harm that you would get. I think the comparison is that you have cruel characters on our side of the house that might blow up something, but there are always going to be portrayed as immoral, meaning that you don't need the nuance in order to get the broad idea that killing people and generally not causing harm is something that is good. I think on that way we win. But secondly, on anti-LGBTQ portrayals and so on, I believe that so many cartoons family have the value of family as a primary good and a primary message. I think at that point it is acceptance between your family members and so on. And we believe that you can't really eliminate all Eastern European and Middle Eastern or old American cartoons on their side of the house, meaning all of these things are as well going to be internalized to a very large degree. Now, moving to rebuilding our case even more. Note, they say that it's harder to make right-wing cartoons because it's hard to make ideas about like lowering taxations and so on. Well, their counterexample is just showing that someone is vulnerable is easier to digest. I firstly don't know why this is exclusive, but I believe that at the point if a kid is not feeling that this is someone from my group, they're less likely to internalize it, meaning that I don't really see the mechanization here. Why does this weigh against each other team in the debate significantly? Firstly, note, kids are in their egocentric stage of their development. That means that they usually prioritize themselves. They always think about themselves when they're 7 to 10 years old. That means that this is a crucial stage where you need to go past that development and implant moral ideals and values that they can have as broad ideas, because they're going to be interacting with more kids and so on when they start school and when they're there. And note, parents cannot be comparative. Why? Because they can't be the embodiment of an ethical character in and of itself. Cartoons have heroes that can shine these values exclusively, where parents are at work and they cannot show the same idea and the same amount of entertainment these values, meaning that this is exclusively and best done by these cartoons. But secondly, note, we win on likelihood of internalization. It is greater because of the opportunity cost. No engagement from opening opposition. Schneider has multiple analysis on why you can't watch both, meaning that if this is a trade-off and opportunity cost, you would rather take this, which is going to be internalized. I would like to engage with closing, sure.
You've successfully managed to mitigate yourselves because your partner says, aha, these political messages are super hard to internalize. So why they internalize the harmful right-wing ones on your side of the house?
That simply washes out your case. So if you're going to run that as rebuttal, that means that you have marginal or bad impacts. I believe that then we outweigh you simply on likelihood of internalization, on broad and more simpler values on our side. And secondly, this is stabbing your own opening by saying that they're not concrete in that sense. Lastly, on backlash, again, no engagement that kids are probably, and if right-wing media spins that cartoons are now forwarding political messages that are too progressive and something, a lot of parents are going to stop their kids from watching cartoons. I think this is especially impactful and very big to weigh, because firstly, you remove fun from kids. Note, it is very important for them to watch these cartoons so they can, whatever cartoon it is, to communicate with their other friends, so they can comment that, so they can play with them. Secondly, note, the trade-off is very simple then. You can have broad ethical messaging or no messaging at all to these kids. And because these values are not pretty much challenged by opening opposition, I would rather have just at least one of them. I think it's a clear OG. Thanks.
Am I in the right place? Yeah. All right, panel ready? two things in this speech. First, I'll talk to you about why this is actually the most effective way to learn the messages that we all want in an applicable method to real-life situations. Secondly, I'll talk to you about why this needs to be done exclusively for kids and they can't simply learn it when they're older, taking down OG's best attack. Before that, though, a bunch of rebuttal. Even before that, just two meta things to note that I think deal with most of what we got. Firstly, if we show political messages also achieve their goal of positive values, we win. That is to say, we don't need to show exclusivity in terms of trade-off. If we get some political benefit, but also gain what they want anyway, there's no reason for them to oppose. But secondly, this is especially important because they can't lie to you about the comparative. The comparative is not all generic ethical messaging. That is to say, when we support political messaging, the other option is more of whatever is normally SpongeBob. Yes, some of it is ethical messaging. Lots of it is just children's entertainment without real positive value. We think, therefore, that we just get more positive value on our side, even if they manage to win on this clash, claiming it's diminishing returns, and we get slightly less in terms of positive messages. We get more messaging on our side. If the messaging is generally positive, we still win. Now, let's get into rebuttal. Firstly, on this whole thing about non-Western movies or old Disney and why they're racist, look, we just think even the non-Western ones are still liberal relative to their countries for the most part, meaning the target audience is more likely to be moved in the right direction than the wrong direction, but also they don't manage to crack Western audiences, so they don't do much harm. And on this whole old Disney, look, old Disney was actually good for kids at the time. It was fairly progressive for the time. We think it moved the world forward, even if not at the greatest pace. We have absolutely no reason to believe that somehow kids would otherwise be reading Judith Butler or getting something more progressive. As such, what we think happened is it was good for its time, and yes, we're happy for these things to update. We think if we oppose it, maybe people will just watch the old stuff, but we actually think it's just better for this to continue. And again, children are much more likely to watch new stuff than old stuff. We don't really think the fact that it's still around is a huge deal, and we don't need to support the fact that it was produced 50 years ago. We need to support what's happening now. And talking about what we need to support, and this is important, look, they give us this case on the right wing and why they might call out the wokeness and people won't see. Firstly, just on a very technical level, the manual makes it very clear, supports or opposed means we need to talk about the likely scenario, not this being everywhere. That said, the scenario in which it actually happens in the real world is that this is primarily Disney and fairly liberal organizations that are actually putting out this media. Now, in case people actually also want structural reasons, because I know that's in debate, so we can also just make it clear liberals are much more likely to go into media subjects and to study these things. The audience is generally younger parents who lean more liberal, and people who have more money are generally more liberal. And note, it just takes a massive amount of capital to create a movie that's worth a lot of people seeing. We don't think they're likely to get that on their side. And lastly, look, there's a reason why my Orthodox Jewish parents let me watch Pocahontas. It's important. There is a lack of viable alternatives, which means it raises the threshold for a ban. Yes, if things are deeply overtly political, it may be banned and it may be called out for wokeness. But these are exactly the same reasons why companies don't go overboard to the point they're being banned. Again, we have to defend the actual scenario, not a blanket, widespread description of this, meaning it doesn't happen, meaning it's enough that even people who grow up in deeply religious or conservative backgrounds are likely to be exposed to these things, and we think these are great messages for them that they don't get elsewhere. And lastly, on this whole thing about Barbie being representative, it's both the closing POI and the last case from opening. Look, literally all children's media is simplistic. That's fairly symmetric. Children aren't going to get really nuanced views. That said, it's not mutually exclusive. It's not like a kid is watching this at 6 and then going, okay, now I won't watch Pocahontas at 19, because it's not made for 19-year-olds. Barbie exists independent of those things. We can support or oppose it, but it's not material to the fact that we want people to learn these things earlier. And also, note, these companies still have every incentive to make it enjoyable. Therefore, for the most part, we think it is much more likely to excite or at least interest kids than to turn them off to the messaging, because if it turns them off the messaging, they turn off the TV and then the company does not make money. Now, let's get into our first point, not yet. So, let's talk about how we actually learn broader principles. Note, and OG essentially concedes this, applied thinking is really difficult for kids, as are all abstract messages. That is to say, even if a kid is told, be nice, it doesn't generally translate into being nice to the people who actually need to be respected, who the kid didn't like anyway. Meaning, in order for a kid to learn how to apply something, he needs to see it in an applied scenario. He needs to understand, here is how this works for the outgroup. Here is how you can be nice to someone who is of a different race. Here is how you can allow people to get married, even if that's not the way your parents got married. We think kids are able to connect these while they're simply unable to apply the messages they learn there for real life. No, this is true for political issues, but it's also true for just the general things. If you want me to play with the kid who looks different than me in school, I am much more likely to be able to do it with a concrete message, which, yes, needs to use some form of politics in order to make it concrete. Explaining to me that people who look different aren't different and should still have the same rights, that is much more likely to allow me, even on a day-to-day basis, to get exactly the things OG wants, meaning we win on their metric of where we just get general good behavior, but that's not it. Let's talk about inclusiveness and empathy and why you specifically get it as a kid. Before that, though, Ayal, who did you not take? Opening.
The empathy message you're describing is literal and outside the house. But most people who have kids are conservatives because having kids is part of their identity. Right-wing media exists and it's extremely problematic and stand behind it.
Right-wing media exists, right-wing media for children. First of all, good luck finding that it really doesn't exist in practice. Coming from a conservative family where the only media we have to watch is still liberal stuff. But also, we just think it's absolutely clear that we support what is happening today. It is happening mostly in these places because overtly conservative stuff, look, if your parents are so conservative that they're not letting you watch anything else, you're going to have those same views from your parents anyway. We don't see a major delta there. Now, look. Empathy and inclusiveness are the main messages you get from here. The reason is because kids are generally selfish. They're naturally self-centered. They're tribal. They cry when someone who's not their parent is holding them. They don't play with the kids they don't know. And it expresses itself in adulthood as tribalism. This is something that needs to be uprooted. And this is something which specifically political messages about outsiders, again, both all the examples in the info slide and just the likely scenario of how political messaging is done in a way that's palatable to children is, look, there are other people you need to care about more than just yourself. Why do we think that you don't naturally grow out of this? 4 reasons, and here we answer OG on just why it's not better when you're older. A, your stance has become entrenched. It's really hard to backtrack if you've been talking this way and bullying someone. B, it's the same with behavior. It's much harder to stop environmental harms than just to not do them in the first place. It's hard to change your behavior. C, your brain is just less plastic. Your tastes don't change as much. So if you have a natural level of disgust or mistrust for a certain race or ideology, you're much less likely to change that. And lastly, there are greater social barriers when you're not in school, already have your friend group. We need it early. We need it clear for all these reasons. Oh.
For POIs, please ask them non-verbally if possible. Am I good to start? Marta, am I good to start? Okay. Both teams on top half have a massive exclusivity issue. Opening government somehow tries to claim that politics are exclusive, but morality is not. If their mechanism for why morality is good is that morality is universal, both parents and educational institutions are going to inculcate basic positive moral norms under either side of a house, such as be kind. Similarly, though, opening opposition also has a massive exclusivity issue. People are still attending things like civics class. If society is as liberal as they are saying, on social media, people are going to be seeing about diverse experiences of those around them. People can watch individuals' YouTube channels. High schools and middle schools are going to have LGBT plus clubs. We think that the only comparative impact in this debate is about the enjoyment of media. I'm going to start by framing why this is most important, prove our argument, and then I'm going to flip opening opposition's best case scenario. Why do we think that enjoyment of children's media matters? Firstly, we think it impacts every single kid around the world who engages with children's media, not just the minority who relate to political messaging or the minority on opening government of, what if the most extreme parents are going to restrict books, but it's about the happiness of every single kid, and often the ability to read books is a unique escape outlet, and the ability to consume media is something that you're able to do by yourself. It's not contingent on having friends. It's not contingent on being on the soccer team, which involves other people. You can do it to unwind after a long day of school. Secondly, we think that more engagement with media, which stems from more enjoyment, leads to higher quality media in the long term. It leads to more funding for authors, which will financially financially support them to write more books, to write better books, because they can research these better and consult a higher number of children's experts and do more market research about what kids on the ground actually want. Why then is media better under our side of the house? We have two main reasons. Firstly, when messaging is political in nature, the entire plot line is like ruined because it becomes about virtue signaling degrees of wokeness that are going to exist. If you buy what opening opposition is saying, and basically the purpose of these like being so liberal is to cater toward a very liberal demographic, like people who are doing this want to make it clear that the message is political in nature in order to reap the benefits of being political in the first place. Often then what you get is like less time being spent on character development because you are focusing more on proving the political message, and also random plot points in order to fit in to the political narrative which we're trying to ultimately generate. The example which you would give here is Ken in the Barbie movie experiences a rapid character transformation from being like a relatively normal dude to becoming an absolutely crazy misogynist. If you actually consider how normal people think, this makes absolutely no sense for his character development whatsoever, but because they had to prove that all women are so deeply oppressed under the patriarchy, they had to ruin his entire line of character development. Our second mechanism under this argument is that moral lessons are a better emotional outlet for kids to be able to relate to. Now, I acknowledge an opening government taglines this argument where they say that politics aren't relevant to kids. The issue is that they significantly miss impact with how kids actually interact with it. We think that the unique value of children's media is for kids who are lonely to be able to relate to books and to find themselves within characters. Given how segmented political messaging is, it's often only going to like impact kids who specifically relate to one aspect of political messaging. Only kids who are part of the environment club in the Lorax, only kids who have very, very progressive parents, as opposed to we think that nearly every single like value-based lesson is something that kids are able to relate to. Almost every kid has been bullied within some aspect of their lives and therefore could relate to the character of August within Wonder. Nearly every single kid has experienced envy at some point, and therefore they can relate to like the evil person within the Snow White film. Why do we think that this is an exclusive platform to be able to identify yourself within media and lacks other avenues? Firstly, kids often lack the language in order to be able to articulate their own insecurities that they are experiencing within their own lives. Often you will know like broad-based concepts like bullying happen. You can say, I am bullied, but often what you don't understand are the nuances surrounding your own experience. Sure, if someone is cyberbullying me, I am bullied, but things like softer dynamics of how social exclusion tends to manifest over time, kids lack the inability to specifically understand the more nuanced and diverse emotions that they're experiencing because they're very young and their brains are simply less developed in nature. So this gives them an ability to relate to characters when they are otherwise unable to articulate it at the end of the day. Secondly, this is also about relatability to negative emotions as well. While positive emotions are taught regardless, a lot of kids struggle with feeling natural insecurity, feeling jealous, feeling things like anger, and you're scared about talking to other people about these emotions because you're worried that your parents are going to be mad at you. You worried that your friends are going to judge you, and you might misapproximate some of these things. We think that then kids will feel a lot more heard if they realize that they are not monsters. Other people are feeling like I am too. Other people are experiencing degrees of envy. Other people get extremely frustrated. Why is this important for kids? We think it's bad if kids see themselves as being monsters and terrible people when they're experiencing what are ordinary human emotions, but because it makes them feel bad and negative on a daily level, but also because it can cause negative cycles. If I'm worried I'm being a bad person because I'm experiencing degrees of envy, because other actors are telling me that envy is bad, I'll be more likely to isolate myself and will be less likely to hang out with other people. When it comes to positive emotions, relating to being bullied, feeling like another character is going through the same thing that you have is important because you no longer feel like a monster, you no longer feel like a freak, you feel like other people are going through what you're going through. Maybe it's not a me problem, maybe it's also a them problem. So we are great for the emotional health of kids. Before I flip OO, I would love to engage with them in a PLI.
Yeah, kids that choose to watch this movie over anything else in theaters or on Netflix enjoy this movie more because it's touching and exciting and designed for them.
No, because of the flip I just gave you. Like what? And even if there's more content that's political, this is because of like a self-selection fact and a race to the bottom. Now, if you're not all political, then you're worried that you're not going to seem woke enough and you're not keeping up with the trends. So even if people are selecting for this, it's because the availability of better forms of media have substantially decreased. Now, I want to do rebuttal and flip OO. So under both sides of the house, we can have like somewhat intersectional characters. We can have gay people in media. We can have women in media. The counterfactual is that the entire movie plotline or book plotline is not revolving around their intersectional identity. They just seem like an ordinary person. We would posit that this is actually better because it's a lot less otherizing. What defines the queer or the feminine experience is not your identity itself, but you're a normal person who does normal things, ergo you are substantially more relatable to the average person. If anything, we would posit that overtly political media leads to substantially worse representations of marginalized groups. While your primary target audience is the woke liberals, you obviously don't want to accrue the kind of like right-wing backlash that opening government characterizes. As a consequence of this, you need to make your minority representations palatable to the vast majority of people. What you often then get are like characters who are woke but also conform to woke stereotypes in ways that are negative. We would give you the example of Esmeralda in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, who is repeatedly called a gypsy by other characters, or the movie Coda about deaf populations who are so contingent on hearing populations. This not only mitigates ob, this is why we prefer people forming political views in the long term when A, they are interacting with others themselves, and B, they have channels like YouTube and social media where they are hearing about first-hand experience rather than watered-down media experiences. Very proud to stand in closing government.
Are we good? Right. The Owl House is a show that came out over the past few years and recently just concluded. It's a show about people who are different, people who are really kind of don't feel like they don't fit in society, people who are bullied, finding a community for themselves and happening to be great. And ladies and gentlemen, that community happens to be people who are bisexual, who are LGBT or whatever, who are relatively progressive. And these kind of examples, I think, show why the closing government case is one of the most insane things I've heard in a very long time. Because they never prove the main burden in their argument, which is to show that there is a trade-off between these political messages and these ethical messages. And insofar as that's the case, they can't prove any extent as to why it is the case that you don't get this kind of good quality media or whatever. Because listen to their analysis. They're just like, oh, this media is terrible and so people don't watch it. But if people don't watch it, then it won't be produced. So therefore, I think the messages are going to happen in relatively good ways. We're going to be very clear from closing opposition with two extensions. The first is going to show the way in which these narratives are internalized by children and how they're presented. We're going to show they are parasitic on and use existing ethical narratives, and so you get the best of both worlds on our side of the house. And secondly, I'm going to talk about backlash and how that's massively outweighed. Okay, on to the first extension. Because top half gets stuck in a kind of bind where opening government are like, these messages are super hard to internalize or whatever. And opening opposition give, genuinely to their credit, brilliant analysis about why the average person who makes this media is likely to be progressive and create good messages. And that's very good. But they don't complete the argument, right? Because that argument is dependent upon showing that kids internalize these messages in good ways. Because it's all well and good having the most progressive, best, media or whatever. If no one watches it or no one really cares about it, it doesn't really do anything in the debate, unfortunately. So I want to fill in that missing gap and thereby claim all of opening opposition's benefits. There are three things I want to note here. The first thing I would note is that these messages are often couched in moral terms or in moral universal principles. So for example, there's a moral universal principle which is like, treat others as you'd like to see yourself treated or treat everyone equally or whatever. And then you use that moral message in something like Zootopia, for example, to point out why racism specifically is a massive attack on that message. And this, by the way, flips closing government as well. Because closing government are just like, but you don't get any basic ethical message anymore. No, because you use those basic ethical messages to also make your political points. You use, a child's love of the outdoors and nature, for example, to make your point in the law acts about how the environment being threatened is terrible. Which means that given that you're basing yourself already on narratives that everyone in this debate and closing government themselves say are already internalized by kids vis-a-vis basic moral principles, that means that you can then parasite on that and kids will likely buy into it. The second thing I would note is the nature of movies specifically in themselves. They are often first personal, right? I.e., you're often seeing things from the perspective of the person who is in that particular minority group, and that engenders a large degree of empathy. So again, I would point to the Owl House being a very good example of this. But the third thing I would note is that kids are much more likely to internalize these messages than the messages that come from, their parents, for example. Because oftentimes we think two things. First of all, the parents talk about like political issues in very complex ways that children don't understand, but also they often don't want to appear as bigoted insofar as that's a gigantic insult and so on. So they're probably not explicitly bigoted or whatever. Insofar as these things are coming in the biggest possible, Disney, etc., whatever, that means that you can then understand it on a far better level and buy into it rather than the parents, like, things that you're told. And look, I think this completes the opening opposition argument and debate as well, because we show why kids are able to interpret this in a good way, which is the second part. That you can't just show that the messages are created themselves in a good way. You also need our argument, and so we complete it and can claim their benefits. Now, the second thing I want to talk about is backlash, because I think that this debate is a bit of a mess, right? Because I think opening government somewhat fairly are like, some of this media might well be right-wing, some of it might be left-wing, whatever. I don't want to get involved in this mess. But what I am going to say is that if you are to any degree uncertain about, how you should weigh how children internalize these narratives, I think the backlash element of this becomes extremely significant. But we think that these messages being propagated in children's media is actually a very, very good thing for public discourse. Why is this? And by the way, I think this is likely a pretty strong impact in the debate. Because what happens, right, under status quo? Oftentimes parents take their kids along to the movies or watch what they're watching with them, and then they discuss these things among themselves. But also, I would note, there's lots of right-wing focus on specifically left-wing left-wing media by opening government's own analysis, right? Because it's seen as like indoctrinating the children, it's seen as something that's completely insane, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now, I want to flip as to why this is actually a good thing. The two things, I want to note here. The first is that, remember what I said in my first point, which is that this is often couched in basic moral notions that everyone can agree with, which means that when right-wing people come out in opposition to these narratives, they look completely insane, right? To give an example, Maya Forstater, who's like a gender-critical person, came out in massive opposition to a random library mascot who was like, happened to be gender-neutral on a huge Twitter thread and just looked completely crazy, right? So when they come opposed to this, because they have these entrenched narratives, because these are the people who are driving the kind of opposition to political narratives, which is what I POI'd opening government, when they oppose this, they look crazy because it looks like they're undermining basic moral values. But secondly, I would note that this forces adults and so on to be explicit about their opposition to basic things that everyone would want to see in the world, like no discrimination. Like, if you're saying that Zootopia is overly political, then you have to force to defend yourself in the public space, and you say you don't like, and it's very hard to find a justification for that's not racist, right, basically. So I think that means that you look terrible. Before I go into the impacts of this opening,
I think its analysis symmetrically applies to right-wing media, as it's also based on basic moral structures, just applied asymmetrically that kids can still buy into.
okay, but with that, I don't understand where the delta is in this debate, because, if you're a right-wing child and you have right-wing parents, and then you've got those things internalized in you, and then you go watch a right-wing movie, like, how does that change the debate? Like I don't understand the impact there. Whereas, I think, so I don't think that makes sense. Okay, but so I want to talk about the impact of this, public discourse point. I think obviously it puts the moderates off from these right-wing culture warrior issues because, as I said, they look extremely extreme and kind of crazy. I think secondly, it empowers liberals, right? Because when these discussions about this media starts to happen socially, you then get these people propagating their own stories. So you see people on Twitter, for example, talking about how Zootopia affected them or whatever, even as they go into adulthood. I think it platforms specific minority groups who are able to talk about these particular issues in response to these crazy Twitter threads as well. But I also think the last thing, and this is perhaps most significant, is that it reduces focus on other cultural war issues, right? Because it's much better to have your right-wing mob or whoever focus on Zootopia or some random movie than on, I don't know, schooling or other things like that. And so insofar as that's the case, insofar as they have limited time to focus on some things, we prefer they focus on these issues. At the end of this debate, I want to be very clear. We're the only team who shows that there is no real trade-off and why the internalization of this is extremely good, but also how that weaponizes into discourse into adulthood as well. So very proud to oppose.
Everyone ready? Panel, I was a very lonely little girl. But when I read books and when I watched movies and I found characters that were like me, characters that made me feel less alone in the world, places where I could retreat anytime someone bullied me or anytime someone was cruel to me, that meant the world to me. We win this debate at the point where we show you that children are better able to enjoy media on their counterfactual when it is not bogged down with political messaging that they cannot understand, and why this is a particularly intense benefit for children who are vulnerable. No, every single child at some point in time is lonely. Every child is sad. Every child deals with feelings that they cannot understand and do not have the language for. Incredibly proud to propose. 3 things in the speech. Firstly, dealing with the responses we get from closing opposition. Secondly, rebutting the case from both op teams about why broadly teaching children left-wing values is good for some reason. And finally, whipping our case. Firstly, the responses we get from closing opposition are, firstly, if political movies are bad, no one is going to watch them. Couple of responses to this. Firstly, often the people who make these movies are fairly self-interested. They have a political message that they want to push. They're going to do anything that they want to push it. This includes a variety of tactics, such as, inflating ratings, or getting focus groups that are likely to agree with you, or just getting focus groups comprised of people from certain groups who will agree, or simply pushing the movie through. Note that you only get ratings for the movie after the movie is out, and the producers can say, oh, well, the movie about political issue A failed, so we can just make the next movie about environmentalism or feminism or racism. There are a variety of other political messages that they can choose. But secondly, they say, oh, political and ethical messages often overlap. Firstly, not always, right? Note that often there are just movies that are fairly offensive in the way that they portray characters from minority backgrounds, or just propagate really, really bad messages. There are 1940s cartoons there are 1940s Disney cartoons like Song of the South that literally have a black character telling 2 white children, oh, things were better before the Civil War, which is absolutely abhorrent. It is not always going to be good messaging, and political and ethical messaging don't always overlap. But additionally, right? At least it is not the main focus when it is politics. At least note that there's a trade-off for children with attention. If children are able to pay attention to the ethical messages, because there are no political messages bogging them down, it means children are more able to internalize the ethical messages. We think internalization of ethical messages is better on our side of the house. Finally, they say that there is a trade-off. Look, I think there's a trade-off at the point where the producer needs to push the message. The producer has a message that they want to make clear. They're therefore likely to sacrifice elements of the plot or make elements of the plot implausible or focus too much on certain characters in order to push a message. They're likely to have characters make insane decisions that don't align with the plot, or decisions that feel inconsistent with the rest of the plot, that leave children wondering, why did they do that? They were such a nice character before they started insulting other children. I think they have a self-interested incentive to do this and are thus likely to do anything to push the fact that they want to have a political message. Cool. Moving on to the opposition case. Broadly, I think the problem with opposition is that they set themselves a ridiculously high burden in a debate about narratives, where they say, we are going to prove that being left-wing is good, and therefore we are going to prove that media is the best way to teach children how to be left-wing. I think this is ridiculous because, firstly, I just don't think everyone is left-wing. I don't think everyone wants to internalize liberal values, and I don't think everyone thinks these are a good thing. There is no consensus on this. This is literally the discussion that politicians and political philosophers have been having for centuries. As a consequence, given that they can't prove these values are always in and of themselves an a priori good, I think that they set that they cannot meet this burden at the point where they don't prove this, and therefore say, we teach children left-wing messaging, but they never say why that's good, or why that's something that we necessarily care about, or why that's something that everyone agrees with. I think they're incredibly reliant on this. But secondly, right? I think the problem with op is that they don't realize that sometimes, and quite frequently, this messaging isn't always beneficial for children. Often the messaging portrays minority characters in a terrible light at the point where they're trying to make a political point. Why is this true? Often when you are going to pitch a political movie to the studio, you want to have some elements in it that water it down in order to avoid right-wing backlash. Therefore, when you make a movie about a black child, you are not going to make you're not going to portray the child very, very positively, because you know that there are studio executives who have preconceived ideas about what this child ought to look like, the personality it ought to have. This means you're more likely to get a kids movie about a black child living in inner city Chicago than a black child living the life that most white children in America live. I think as a consequence, often because incentives are skewed and you want to avoid backlash, it is likely that these portrayals are negative. But secondly, even if producers' incentives are good, there are often implicit biases that you cannot account for. If you are a person who isn't disabled, you have no idea what disabled people are like. So even if you genuinely want to make a movie that is good for them, you are likely to make fuck-ups along the way. You are likely to screw up and portray them in ways that are accidentally offensive, insofar as you often don't know what you're doing. And because there are so few people from minority experiences within Hollywood executive rooms, there are very few people who can vet this and say this is accidentally quite offensive. Why is this bad, right? I think here's where our flip to opening opposition comes in. Children from identity groups see more movies about themselves where they are used as political tools, where they are used as a means to convey a message, where they are used in order to push someone's agenda, as opposed to movies where they are simply just kids playing with every other child on the playground. I think this is harmful insofar as they see themselves being instrumentalized, but they also see very offensive portrayals of themselves that make them feel terrible and make them feel as though they're subhuman. Annika.
How can it simultaneously be the case that these movies are so woke that no one even wants to watch them, they're terrible, and also that they're so offensive that actually the minorities themselves feel massively harmed?
Yeah, so often people in Hollywood are trying to balance both ends of the spectrum. You want lots of people to watch your movie, therefore you are likely to make it as palatable as possible and as appealing to both left-wing people by having one character who is a person of color and propagates a political message, but also to right-wing people by creating a character that fits within their preconceived ideas of what people of color look like. I think as a consequence they often have to straddle a very uneasy middle, which means that they are often left creating characters that are quite offensive, even if by accident. Right. Why is it preferable if this diversity is shown apolitically, and why is this better at conveying ethical values? I think on the comparative, when characters in television or characters in film are children's characters who are people of color, or people who are disabled, or LGBT characters who aren't politicized, I think this is better, because when the focus is on showing ethical messaging, the focus is often on, oh, this is just another person, and you should treat them the same way you should treat every other child. You should be kind to them. You should be compassionate to them. You should hug them when they are sad. They are often shown as just another child instead of as a means to portray a political message. I think this means that it's better if diversity is shown apolitically, insofar as even if you are not a child from a minority background, you are likely to engage with children from other minority backgrounds, insofar as most of us live in a fairly diverse and global world. Proud to propose.
For clarity's sake, given that closing government wanted to have their own debate, I'm going to take them out independently. Then I'm going to explain our extension, where we are extending meaningfully of opening opposition, how we break not necessarily the deadlock, but I think the lack of impacting which occurs in the top half, regardless of how you resolve top half, and why that is significant and wins the debate. Firstly, with closing government, the first thing that they point out is that enjoyment for children's media matters. I would posit a couple of things. The first is they never actually give sufficient explanation, as I'll go into, as to why our movies are likely to be less fun and less accessible, but secondly by their own narratives of how they would push things like being kind or why bullying is bad, and internalizing the perspective of a single person and emphasizing the stories of how that person was bullied so that you can feel heard. They also exclude kids who have never been bullied or have never suffered those experiences. They never explain why specifically to kids identity is uniquely polarizing and uniquely likely to make you feel bad or likely to make you feel like an outsider. The reason that this is important is because everybody else in the debate has accepted that kids are different and have let to internalize these political messaging which tell them that things like race are significant or tell them that things like LGBT stuff is significant. So they're not having that in their case. I just don't know what to do with this weighing as to why entertainment matters. Second thing that they say is that plots get worse. The reason that they give this is that there is a woke race to the bottom, which means that you do more damage to the plot. I would note firstly that we can go and do example tennis all day. We have Zootopia, we have Owl House. We do it really, really well. They don't even use human beings. They use the different species of the animals to explain why it is the case that treating people differently due to inherent intrinsic characteristics is wrong. So I don't think that pointing out that the Barbie movie exists is structural analysis. I don't even think the Barbie movie is a kid's movie. But secondly, I would know it just contradicted the last part of the member of the opposition speech, where they literally talk about why the movies will be more watered down and moderate. Now, the GovWhip has an interesting response here in response to our POI. They say Hollywood balances these things out, and let's give the fairest conception. They're saying Hollywood balances these things out, and therefore you arrive at something that pleases no one. I would note that by their own opening government's analysis, it is unlikely to be the case that the vast majority of right-wing people initially watch these. Because if you believe the opening government's analysis, then it is the case that these movie directors already know that they are going to be, at least initially, pitching to a distinctly liberal crowd. This harms opening opposition insofar as the people don't watch the movies. But it doesn't harm us because we have an independent extension about why the backlash amongst adults is actually better for persuading adults to join your side of the cause, because the nature of the backlash is likely to put off moderates and is likely to ensure that liberals actively have these discussions with their kids in the first place, where they may have also themselves considered these political issues not to be relevant to kids, but have the views that racism is wrong. They now have those explicit discussions. I would note that even if you don't believe our first extension, we're just not vulnerable in the same way to that. The final thing that I would note on closing government is that they say wider values of kindness and bullying allow kids to relate to characters who go through things like them, versus political messaging, which is inherently accusatory. Three things here. Firstly, they give no explanation as to why the trade-off exists. You have the classics, and I'm not talking the 1940s classics that nobody watched. God knows why they brought it up. I'm talking classics like from the 90s who say that you should all have kumbaya and that you shouldn't do bullying. Those exist in droves. They still get watched by kids because they are classics. There is no trade-off here. In fact, I think opening government has better analysis on this, because at least opening government say children have limited time. But again, it is unclear why the fact that kids have limited time means that they can't see and internalize both. Secondly, Anaket's analysis explicitly explains to you why it is that through the establishment of those values, through the fact that kids already see those types of movies about general values because they're the classics, through the fact that there can still be films that talk about general values which occur in this space and get created, and through the fact that via our POI to opening government, you already have multiple values and ways that you can be teaching general values, like in school, like your parents. Your parents aren't going to want you to be a bully, for goodness sake, regardless of their political views. All of these things mean that we can use those existing narratives to add the logical extension to children that racism means not being kind to somebody. Now, here's why this matters so much in the debate. Kids, just like everybody else, are full of logical inconsistencies. And it's worse because, as OO say, they're malleable. But here's the thing. You can be a nice person to other people, but have a specific understanding of a group or a specific aversion to a group, which means that you depart from that for that group. So it is the case that you can get the most hospitable and lovely people in the south of America. It is the case that Balkan hospitality can be unrivaled. But when it comes to specific people, there are counter narratives which kids will grow up with, which mean that they exclude them from even perceiving that being kind to them is relevant, or that you should be kind to those individuals. The way that we intersect with our extension then is and solving that gap is the biggest and most important thing in the debate. And we intersected that specific gap, because I'm done with CD, in two ways. The first was to say that specifically children's media is good at pushing these messages. We accept that opening opposition do identify the importance of the aim, because the aim is to teach kids that you need to consider racism as it being kind. You need to care about these people. The problem is they don't have the analysis for why this is comparatively better and why this engages with the social narratives that opening government were talking about. We told you that the narratives of good versus evil, that the first person perspectives which are inherent to these films mean that you are far more likely to engender kids' apparently inherent sense of injustice. Check your notes. That is literally a term that we got from the opening government prime minister, which means that you're far more likely for kids to internalize these values. Secondly, we told you it was a perfect and logical extension of things that we've had before, as I've already explained. But finally, because it is just better and more pointed at kids than the messaging that they get from their parents, because their parents talk about how black people commit crime or affirmative action, actually concepts that kids don't understand. We talk about how a mouse or a moose has to be nice to people. Yes, OG.
Excuse case ignores Mitchell's analysis of why egocentric children primarily need ethics, and their ability to internalize morality is undercut by political messages, either because of limited mimicking ability or by potentially bad political messages.
I just don't think that any Gov team has conclusively proved the trade-off with ethical messaging. I think that we have dealt with it in our case. I've dealt with it explicitly, and a POI is too late to point it out. What does all of this mean for the round? Independently, Aniket's first extension is winning. And the reason why is because we prove why uniquely, given how kids have multiple influences in their lives, this is a particularly good way to talk about these political values. They ask, why do kids need to know them? One, if we prove that this is the best way to talk about them, they are like, and that parents aren't going to be as good at coming back with alternate narratives, then kids are more likely to have those values in adulthood. That solves and actually impacts the case. Two, I would note that racism in school and transphobia in school is actually fucking bad. It's actually awful because kids get taught that you should be kind, but they don't get taught that you should be kind to someone when they look different, or when they're trans, or when they're black, because their parents have counter narratives which throughout their life are pervasive. We prove that you get that better. If not, we prove you get better societal discussions. Two unique extensions which win the round.